Hey, Rick from SuperPie here. Today I want to talk about a project that didn't make the final cut on our Instagram filter course. It's a pretty cool little project, kind of like Hall of Mirrors style filters. You can see as I move my hands around, we have this kind of like Hall of Mirrors kind of effect. Now this didn't make the cut because we kind of cover something similar in the course, but I just want to talk about how this is made. Now this would be towards the end of the course, so it's a little bit more technical and there's a few steps to kind of build up to this, but I still want to talk about how this stuff works. So the first thing that I'm using here is Spark AR. Spark AR is the tool that Facebook have built to make Instagram and Facebook camera filters. As you can see here, we have this cool little effect going on. Now, how do we go about making this from scratch? Now, of course, I downloaded Spark AR. I have this open. I'm using a thing called a patch editor to make the code. The light's it's quite cloudy in the background, so my light is going in and out. But what we can do is make a brand new project from scratch, and I'll deploy this to Instagram and show you how this is working. So first thing that I'm going to do is make a brand new project from scratch in Spark AR. Here we go. And I'm just going to close this background one for now. So bye-bye, off it goes. And what I'm going to do is just open this up, make it a little bit bigger. So what I'm kind of planning to do here is take the camera texture, which is going to basically look kind of like this, and distort it. So how do we go about doing this? Now, at the moment, as you can see here on this kind of sidebar, we have the device, which has a camera, has things like lighting and a microphone on there. Now, what I want to do is play around with the camera texture itself. So I'm going to select camera, and I'm going to extract the texture by going here and clicking plus. Now, this gives me something called camera texture 0. I'm going to just keep it as that for now. Basically, what I want to do is replicate the camera within this whole area. So I'm going to right click on focal distance and add a new canvas. Now the canvas is just going to be this kind of area that pops in. I'm going to add to my canvas by right clicking a new rectangle in here. Now you can see here this new rectangle's in the top corner. I need this to basically fill the screen. So here on width, I'm going to click fill width, and also on height, fill height. Now this is just going to give me this kind of texture. There's no material on this yet, so I'm going to make a new material here just by clicking plus. Now material 0 is the default one. I'm going to double click this. What I want to do is replicate the camera. Now I've got the camera texture down here, and I basically want to match this up. So I'm going to click my standard to flat. So this is just not going to give me any lighting on here. And then for my texture, I'm just going to replace it with camera texture. Now what this does is basically repeats exactly what we're seeing right now. So this looks no different than before, but what it means we can do is we can replace the texture, we can do stuff with it. So for instance, if I want to change the color here, maybe I want to make it more gray, this is actually giving me a grayer background based on this texture. Now of course what we want to do is not just change the color, we actually want to change how this looks. So how do we go about doing this? So we need to add some kind of like code or some kind of method for being able to edit things. So what I'm going to do within Spark AR is go to View and then Show Hide Patch Editor. What this will do is it will give me a way to interact with these different layers and these textures and these materials and these canvases and these rectangles within Spark AR itself. Now what is the thing that I actually want to change? The thing I want to change is the texture. I want to kind of make this distorted instead. So the first thing I'm going to do is click this little arrow here. And what this will give me is the material. Now this lets me change the material and do things with it. Now to make this a little bit easier to see, I'm just going to click Option, scroll, or is it Option or Control? There we go, it's actually Command, and I can scroll in. So what do I want to do here? Well, I want this texture, this end texture here, to kind of replicate the camera. So I can take this camera texture and drag it into my patch editor. I want to just connect the two at the moment, so I'm going to draw a line between these two areas. Now what this is doing at the moment is pretty much what we have on the screen, is taking this camera texture which has an RGBA, 4 different parts to it, the colors, and then an alpha channel, and then just directly mapping it to the diffused texture, which is basically what we're seeing on screen. So this is kind of like it's not there at all, but now what we can do between this is start to play around with this. So I'm going to basically add a little bit of room between the two, and on my patch editor I'm going to right click. Now here, it gives me a lot of things that I can actually do within Spark AR itself. I can play around with the animation, I can play around the device, face landmarks, interaction layers, that kind of thing. But what I'm going to find is a texture sampler. So I'm just going to click texture sampler. This is going to give me a new way to change what is going on. So here, instead of this going directly to here, from line to line, this is now going to go into the texture sampler, and this texture sampler is going to go out here. Now, at the moment, this is going to give me a white screen. The reason for that is it's selecting exactly 0 and 0 on this texture, and this is going to be everywhere. So at the moment, at this top corner on the camera, this is white. Now, if I go into my camera on, just quickly, what we'll see is in the background, this is kind of gray, because if I move my hand, you can see my hand here, if I move this to the top corner, it will start going kind of like a pink color, because that's my hand. The pixel in that top left corner at the moment is at 0 and 0. Now, if I want to move this into the middle, I can just change some of the numbers, like 0.5 and 0.5. So this is kind of doing it on my face. Again, if I move my hand into the middle, it gets lighter and darker, depending on my face. I think it's selecting maybe my beard or mustache at the moment. But what we can do now is start to pick what things we want to pick. Now, of course, what we want to do is distort every single pixel at every single point. Now, how do we do that? Again, I'm going to right click here, and I'm going to pick something completely different, the vertex attributes. Now here, what I want to do is pick exactly the texture coordinates and pass this in. Now, the reason for doing this is basically it's picking every single point on this and exactly picking that same texture at the same point as well. Now, what this gives us is pretty much the same thing as what we have on screen. Now, why? Well, what we want to do is start playing around with this and move these kind of texture coordinates around. So rather than this going directly from here to here, what we can start to do is pick different pixels at different points to distort the image. Now, what I'm going to do is just start to shift myself along the page a little bit. So here, what I'm going to do is add a new thing between them, which is saying add. Now, add, what I want to do is take my texture coordinates and add a little bit to it in two different directions. At the moment, it's just a number. I can pick a vector 2. I want to go across and down. So the texture coordinate's going to go in here, and I'm going to do the output into this UV. Now, of course, what I can start to do now is add different distortion. So this could be 0.1, and this is going to shift me over by 0.1 every single pixel. Again, if I start moving myself 0.2, 0.3, 0.4, we start to distort the screen somewhat. Now again, if I move this up and down 0.4 in this direction, you'll see this kind of running out of room down here and kind of just repeating itself down there. Now, of course, what we want to do is not distort just by a set number. We want to distort it based on something. And what is that something? Well, what we're going to be using is a distortion map, a displacement map, as it's sometimes called as well. Now, I've made two images up here that we can see that look like this. Now, this is the first one that I've made. This is basically made in Photoshop. I made this just by making a gray area and putting some kind of blurs on it. And also there's other ones that I found online as well. This is a kind of displacement map that looks something like this. So completely different, but each one is going to give us completely different effects. Now, what I want to do is take these two images that I've made, and I'm just going to put them into my texture area. There we go. It's just added them in. Now, what I want to do is distort based on something to do with these images. Now, what do I want to do to distort this? Now, in my displacement one that I've made in Photoshop, basically what I want to say is if this area is gray, I want there to be no distortion. But if this area is black, I want to shift it to a certain left position. If it's white, I want to distort it to the right position. So depending how gray or white or black this is, I want to distort this number for each individual pixel. So basically at the moment, I've got the set number that's shifting over each time. So at the moment, if I just reset back to 0 and 0, we'll be back to normal. But now I want to base this distortion on this thing that I've just made. So how do we do this? Now I want to use the same kind of technique as what I've got here. I want to pick a texture, but not the camera texture, this displacement texture, sample it, depending on where it is right now, and then shift this around based on something. So I'm going to use pretty much the same technique as what I've got here. So I'm going to take this displacement in, I'm just going to drag it in, and I'm going to do kind of the same as what I have here. I want another texture sampler. I'm going to pass this in, and I want to pick it based on the kind of current frame. So again, vertex attribute, and again I want to pick the texture coordinates and pass that in. Now what this outputs is a color. Now the color is an RGBA color. Now I want to pick how gray it is. Now RGBA doesn't really give me a gray. I could do some math and kind of work it out, but luckily Spark AI has something in here. So again, I'm just gonna right click here, and I'm gonna pick something called a color space. Now, color space is saying take this input color and turn it into something else. Now, at the moment, my input color is RGB, and I want to change this to one of these other ones. I've got hue, saturation, value, or hue, saturation, lightness. Now, lightness is kind of how gray it is, so I'm going to pick this one. So this is going to give me an output, which is going to give me a few different numbers based on how gray it is. Now this output is basically a vector. A vector has like 3 or 4 or 2 numbers in there. What I want to do is take one of these values. I've got H, I've got S and L, hue, saturation, lightness. I want to unpack this. Now, at the moment I can unpack it using this. I've got hue, saturation, lightness. My lightness is Z. So the last one, hue, saturation, lightness. So how gray this is based on this. Now again, I'm just going to take all this stuff, just move it over so I can kind of fit this in. I want this to go in here. I want this to shift over by a certain lightness every single time. So how much lightness do I want to shift things over by? Well, it depends on this. So I'm going to take this X, and basically I'm going to put this number, it's a single number, into a pack. A pack is going to turn a number into a vector. I want it to be a 2-digit number, 1, 2. So this is going to input here, and then Y direction I don't want to shift. I'm going to take this and shift it over. So what this will do is just instantly add this kind of like Hall of Mirrors effect in here. Now you can kind of see, especially if I hold up something that's kind of gridded, I've got my Rubik's Cube that's going to come in here. You can kind of see this matching up to the same as what I've got below. So if you look at my kind of corner area down here, you can see this kind of repeating on the actual page itself. I've got a circle here, circle here, circle here. I've got this kind of like L-ish shape down here as well, which looks like that. This kind of matches up to what we've got down here. Now at the moment, this is too extreme. This is kind of shifting everything over based on a certain 0 to 1, which is kind of white to black. Now I want to basically not shift over if it's gray. Gray's in the middle. So before I do this, what I'm going to say is I want to subtract. I'm going to subtract 0.5 to basically make it go not between 0 and 1, but between minus 0.5 and plus 0.5. So now I'm going to pass this in here instead. So let me push this in. So now what I have is basically the same kind of effect. I've got this based on gray. I'm going to take this away, so I'm kind of in the middle. If it's gray, it's in the middle of this. And then I'm going to shift over in the X direction, no change in the Y direction, and basically then say to the camera, pick this and shift my pixels over depending on what I should get. This is kind of an extreme version. As you can see, it's pretty extreme in these kind of circles. So what I can do to make it less extreme is multiply this number. Now I'm going to multiply this number and pass it back in. So I've got my connection between the two and say, well, it's too extreme right now. Maybe something like 0.5 kind of softens it up. Maybe 0.2 softens it up even more. Obviously, if it's 0, there's no shift at all. So there, I'm just kind of starting to increase the numbers and play around with it. So by just adding a lot of these kind of effects in, basically I'm taking this distortion map and saying, pick how gray it is. And if it is gray, don't shift at all, which is here. Obviously by a certain amount, how extreme it should be, and then pass that into the texture and shift left and right depending on how gray that is as well. Now of course I could change all of these kind of numbers in here, but hopefully you can see that just by adding something pretty quickly in here, I can take the texture itself, pick these different areas around there and sample from different areas. Now of course I've done this based on this kind of displacement map here. I could change it on different ones as well. I've got my rock displacement map. I'm going to drag this in, and instead of this displacement one, I'm just going to take it and push this in a different way. And now this gives me a completely different texture. So you can see here, this is kind of how gray this is. This is kind of how this one looks versus this kind of completely different displacement map. This gives me kind of like a frosted window effect that looks a little bit different as well. So just by changing this texture, I have a completely different look and feel. And of course, if I change this, I can start playing around with some of these numbers. Maybe I want to make it less extreme, so I kind of filter back in a different way. But what we can do by just adding a tiny bit of these kind of patch editor things, I can make something that has this kind of displacement effect really, really easily. So let's just see this in action. Again, I'm going to take this, going to put it back to my normal displacement one. I'm just going to quickly test it on my device. I'm going to send it to my Spark AI player, and what I should get on my phone is something that looks like that. So it's something that looks pretty good, pretty quick to add in. It's very quick displacement filter that we can add.